Hi, welcome to our YouTube-friendly version of NTD News. What you'll see here is only the content that YouTube allows. For our complete, uncensored broadcast, head on over to ntd.com, and you can click on the link below. See you there. An apocalyptic scene in Hawaii as deadly wildfires rage across Hawaii's Big Island and Maui, destroying buildings and forcing evacuations and rescues. Maui County officials say at least 6 people have died in the fires there. Here's the voice of a Maui resident whose house got burned by the fire.
I know for a fact people didn't get out. I know when we were pulling away, there's quite a few homeless people in the area, and people who are just not able, don't have access to vehicles. When the fire started, I heard the first explosions of the gas stations exploding, and then I saw the black smoke a couple streets away, and within half an hour, we were out the door.
The Coast Guard has rescued at least 12 people who jumped into the ocean to escape the smoke and flames. Several hospitals are overwhelmed with patients suffering burns and smoke inhalation. Cell service, including 911, is down across Maui, making evacuations and rescues even more challenging. About 14,000 homes and businesses in Maui have lost power. Hundreds of families have already lost their homes in the town of Lahaina. Strong winds from a passing hurricane are driving the fires. Hawaii has declared a state of emergency, and the White House says it's in contact. Tourists are also being urged to stay away from Maui due to the dangerous conditions. And more details surfaced on the indictment of former President Trump. Special counsel Jack Smith obtained a search warrant for Trump's Twitter account back in January. That's according to court documents released today. The warrant required Twitter, now called X, to supply Smith with certain information about Trump's account. A federal appeals court judge ended up holding the company in contempt and imposing a $350,000 fine for failing to comply with the order by the deadline. The DOJ also obtained a non-disclosure order prohibiting Twitter from releasing information about the case. Smith's office argued that disclosing the search warrant to Trump would put the investigation at risk, suggesting it could give him the opportunity to destroy evidence. The Twitter warrant is part of Smith's investigation into the former president's alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Bank records released today show more than $20 million paid to the Bidens, the foreign cash flowing from oligarchs in Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan. NTD's congressional correspondent Melina Weiskup reports.
So this third memo by the Oversight Committee is the result of subpoenaing 6 banks, and it's focused on payments made to Hunter Biden by wealthy foreigners. Now, for example, one foreigner that's mentioned here is a Russian billionaire by the name of Yelena Bachurima. He paid $3.5 million to Hunter Biden and his business partner, Devin Archer, through a company known as Rosemont Seneca. The key thing here that the Oversight Committee notes is the timing of this payment, as well as others made by oligarchs in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, for example. These payments happened in the February of 2014 and the spring of 2014. Then just months later, then Vice President Biden sat down and joined a dinner with Hunter Biden and these same business partners that he was engaging with. Not only one dinner, but 2 dinners. To be clear, President Biden has not been directly linked to any of those payments, but there is an account that received money that's linked to an unidentified Biden. Now, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer, I recently asked him if the lacking of this hard evidence would impact their investigation. He said that witness testimony could fill those gaps.
See, that would need to be a proof of communications that you would need to look at, right? And if there's...
Or people that were in the room, people that know exactly what.
And in other news, there are more updates about a man named Eric Schwerin. So he was the president of Rosemont Seneca. Fox recently did an analysis from visitor logs at the White House revealing that Schwerin visited the White House under Obama's presidency more than 36 times. He also met directly with President Biden one of those times, and he also visited then Vice President Biden's home personally at least 15 times. So what's next for Comer's investigation? More digging. He says he'll continue to follow the money, continue to request more witness testimony to ultimately discover whether or not our national security has been compromised. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
An assassination threat against the president. This morning, a Utah man was shot and killed during an FBI raid after he allegedly made threats against President Biden and other officials. This came just as the president was gearing up for a fundraising event in Park City. The suspect was identified as 75-year-old Craig Robertson. He was shot at around 6:15 a.m. local time in Provo, Utah. And according to the FBI, Robertson had a history of making threatening posts online, suggesting he would kill the president and several other politicians. And the latest threat came on Monday when he said he was preparing to assassinate Biden when he arrived in Utah. Robertson was facing 3 charges, including interstate threats, threats against the president, and influencing, impeding, and retaliating against federal law enforcement officers by threat. The White House was briefed on the matter, and the Secret Service referred questions to the FBI. And the Biden administration today announcing new bans on U.S. investments that could help the Chinese military. It comes amid mounting bipartisan concern over national security threats posed by the communist regime. NTD's Iris Tao has more from the White House.
President Biden on Wednesday signed an executive order to ban certain U.S. investments in Chinese artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and semiconductors. Biden writes in the executive order that such sensitive technologies can be used for the military, intelligence, and surveillance by countries of concern, which constitutes, quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. Biden adds that certain U.S. investments risk exacerbating this threat, and he thereby declares a national emergency to deal with this threat. The latest move comes amid growing bipartisan concerns over threats from the Chinese communist regime. The Biden administration last year restricted exports of advanced chips to China, and he stressed today,
America invented these chips. You all know semiconductors are those little small computer chips about the size of any fingertip that affect nearly everything in our lives, from cell phones to automobiles, refrigerators, to the most sophisticated weapon system.
Without access to those computer chips, China's military is at a disadvantage, its economy is at a disadvantage, its manufacturing sector is at a disadvantage. Cars have hundreds of computer chips in them.
The new restrictions are expected to go into effect next year. Reporting from White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
An American nurse and her daughter have been released after being kidnapped in Haiti. The State Department today praised the release.
I will say that we welcome the reports of their release. We have no greater priority, of course, than the safety and security of U.S. citizens overseas. We express our deepest appreciation to our Haitian and U.S. interagency partners for their assistance in facilitating for their safe release, and out of respect for their privacy, we'll let the individuals speak for themselves when they feel ready.
American nurse Alex Dorsainville and her daughter were kidnapped in the capital port of Prince on July 27th. El Roy, Haiti. The organization Dorsainville works for put out a statement announcing their release and expressing, quote, immense joy at the development. Haitian gangs frequently carry out kidnapping for profit operations targeting local communities for ransom payments. And the oldest sitting member in the U.S. Senate has suffered another health scare. California Senator Dianne Feinstein was once again hospitalized on Tuesday following a minor fall at home. Feinstein's spokesman said that she was in the hospital very briefly just to get it checked out. All of her scans came out clear and she eventually returned home. The Democratic senator was also hospitalized earlier this year by a shingles diagnosis that kept her out of her seat for months. Feinstein's absence from the Senate prompted calls of resignation from her colleagues on both sides. Last week, the 90-year-old lawmaker handed power of attorney to her daughter, Catherine, granting her the authority to act on her mother's behalf. Earlier today, Governor Ron DeSantis suspended the second Florida state attorney in a year. The attorney pushing back and calling the suspension a political hit job. NTD's Arlene Richards reports.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has suspended his second Democratic state prosecutor in a year. On Wednesday morning, he announced the suspension of Orange-Osceola County State Attorney Monique Worrell. DeSantis said he's removing her from office for not following the laws of Florida and what he called a pattern of avoiding mandatory minimum sentences on several different offenses. The governor cited cases involving gun crimes, drug trafficking, and child pornography.
Prosecutors have a duty to faithfully enforce the law. One's political agenda cannot trump this solemn duty.
He said Worrell's office had a practice of allowing juvenile offenders to avoid serious charges or incarceration, and noted the shooting over the weekend of 2 Orlando police officers by a 28-year-old repeat offender. The offender had been arrested in March for sexual battery on a minor while he was on probation for another offense. He was released again. Worrell called her suspension a political hit job. During a press conference this morning, Worrell said there's another reason why the governor suspended her.
This is simply a smokescreen for Ron DeSantis' failing and disastrous presidential campaign. He needed to get back in the media in some positive way that would be red meat for his base.
Worrell believes the suspension came in response to her stance on police accountability, saying her prosecution of a former Orlando police officer angered Florida police. She has defended her record despite high-profile crimes under her watch, and vowed that the suspension would not stop her from running for re-election. DeSantis said prosecutors do have some discretion to decide which cases to bring, but he said Worrell abused that discretion, which effectively nullified certain Florida laws. The governor appointed Orange County Judge Andrew Bain to take over as state attorney for the 9th Judicial Circuit. DeSantis appointed him to the bench in 2020. Steph?
Thanks, Arlene. And next, New York City's mayor today changing his approach to tackling the immigration crisis, laying out exactly how many $1 billion the city will have to spend if things don't change. The goal? Financial aid from the federal government. NTD's Arian Pazdar has more.
But we are past our breaking point.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams on Wednesday again calling for financial aid from the federal government. That's to assist the sanctuary city with the ongoing immigration crisis. Adams laid out how much the city is expected to spend on immigration over the next 3 years.
More than $12 billion.
Adams is asking both state and federal government for more funding and space to house immigrants. He recently said the city is currently considering housing people in tent cities in Central Park, among other locations. Adams on Wednesday also challenged the city's right to shelter law. The Big Apple has to provide beds and care to anyone in need because of the law.
That is just not sustainable. It's not realistic. And so because of that, you're finding people come from all over the globe.
The city is reportedly spending almost $10 million on illegal immigrants every day. And the number of people seeking shelter is expected to double within the next 10 months. Meanwhile, at a border town down in Arizona, House Republicans held a field hearing on immigration on Tuesday. A local rancher described the impact the influx of people has, saying some are cutting his fences.
I spend 50% of my time fixing fences, broken water lines, and getting cattle off the highway.
And a local county sheriff talked about the dangers imposed by cartels.
Border-related crime is at an all-time high. Death, murder investigations, agents, troopers, deputies, and others are addressing dangerous scenarios, criminals as a direct result of an open border exploited by these criminal cartels for violence, fear, and greed.
The sheriff is calling on the federal government to issue an action plan which prioritizes the southern border. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
And in business and financial news, S&P Global has dropped the ESG scale it launched in 2021 to score publicly rated companies. S&P, which is one of the world's largest raters of corporate debt, said the decision would take effect immediately. For more on this, NTD Business's Don Ma speaks with an ESG expert.
And now I'm happy to bring in Will Hill, the Executive Director at Consumers Research. So Will, S&P Global will no longer publish ESG scores along with its credit ratings. Can we come to the conclusion that the ESG scoring system has not worked in the past couple of years, and that's why S&P is dropping it?
That's a great question. Basically, that's what S&P admitted to, is that the scores themselves really weren't that useful for anyone who's tried to use them. And we're really seeing a retreat across the entire ESG industrial complex as it becomes more and more clear that these scoring systems don't really work as advertised.
And I want to point out some of its flaws, and maybe you can help me with that. But I think one of them is that the ESG rating is very vague. It's applying unmeasurable factors on companies. For example, like if you get a 1 out of 5 score, I mean, what does that even mean?
Right, exactly. And there really is no clear way to determine these ESG scores. Everyone that does them slightly differently, and it really comes down to extremely subjective measures. It come down to the opinion of the personnel that happen to work at these companies. When you look at things like the S, for example, it's supposedly about the company's stands on social issues. That's an eye of the beholder. Somebody who's far left will see things one way. Someone who's maybe more in the middle will see them another. And it really comes down to making basically values-based judgments about the politics of certain companies, which not only does that push those companies in political directions because they feel like they need to curry favor with these graders, but it has nothing to do with the underlying performance of these companies, which is what S&P is supposed to be in the business of judging, not these subjective value-based measures. Right. And one of the indicators in ESG is human rights. I mean, how do you put a score? How do you measure that? Well, to tell you the truth, they don't, because one man's human rights in one country is looks horrible in another. And what I mean by that is the S is not graded across all countries equally. So when you look at an S score in a company that's got most of its operations in America, the companies that score the ESGs often treat American companies on a very different playing field than companies that operate in the third world or operate in China or Russia, for example. And so when you're looking at an ESG score, it's not even clear, regardless of the subjectivity of the human rights measurements being made by the personnel that's doing it, it's not even clear that those standards are being applied evenly across companies, across the world, or even their operations in different countries. For example, a lot of electronic vehicle companies have very, very high E and S scores. Yet the cobalt that's necessary to build the batteries for these cars, often almost all of it is mined in open pit mines, staffed by child slave laborers in the Congo. And then it's moved to China, where most of it is processed. About 90% of the cobalt in the world is processed in China, with almost no environmental controls and a ton of emissions into the air. And that's another criticism of ESG, that the E part, for example, has not helped the environment. Not at all. And in fact, there's more and more studies showing that not only does it not help, often companies run to the E score when they're actually hiding things that have gone on in their company's operations from real issues like the ones I mentioned in the Congo, with environmental problems that some of these companies have had. So the EO is almost there to distract from environmental issues, not to actually make the companies focus on them and clean them up. All right. Thank you so much today, Will. Thanks so much for having me.
More and more companies are blaming shoplifting for lower profits. In light of this, we look at the practice of releasing suspects before their trial without requiring them to pay bail, also known as no cash bail, an idea that's growing in popularity.
More and more retailers are calling out shoplifting for eating into their balance sheets. Shoplifting made retailers lose an estimated $87 billion in 2022. This as the practice of no cash bail grows in popularity. This is the practice of releasing suspects before their trial without requiring them to pay bail, depending on the crime they're charged with. Normally, after a suspect is arrested, they have to attend a trial. The trial happens on a later date, several weeks or maybe even months after the arrest. Authorities want to make sure the suspect will attend the trial. So during this time, the suspect may have to wait in prison, or he or she could pay bail and go home.
Bail is all about the promise to show up for trial. And if you eliminate bail, you somewhat eliminate the consequences for if you skip out on the trial.
Law professor Ron Rishlock says there will still be an arrest warrant out for suspects who don't show up for trial. But he says young people tend to ignore long-term consequences and focus on immediate consequences. Rishlock sees a correlation between a rise in shoplifting and no cash bail, but
I don't know whether there's causation. I mean, there may be other factors involved that are really driving the causal, the cause of the increase in crime. However, the fact that there is a correlation means I think you got to look at it.
Illinois is the first state in the nation to completely eliminate all cash bail. Governor J.B. Pritzker signed the policy into law in early 2021. It survived a legal challenge in July and will go into effect next month. Meanwhile, states like California, New York, New Jersey, and New Mexico either have or are considering bail policies that are less strict than other states.
The direction that they've gone is, I'm afraid, is wrong, and there needs to be a reform of bail reform.
Former law enforcement official Jason Johnson says real bail reform needs to look at a variety of factors, not just the nature of the charge. The main problem is that suspects who are released may pose a danger to society.
We've seen a number of defendants released that are later rearrested and released again, and are released pending charges that should indicate a risk to public safety if they're released pending trial.
Supporters of no cash bail say suspects have their lives destabilized when they can't make bail. They can't take care of their families when they're sitting in a jail cell. Proponents also claim that most people do show up for trial after their release. They say not having enough money shouldn't decide whether someone sits in a jail cell or not. Colin Fredrickson, NTD News.
Do men belong in women's sports? The state of Texas is saying no, though the ruling was met with plenty of opposition. NTD's Dave Martin has more.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed the Save Women's Sports Act on Monday to keep school sports teams separated by the gender at birth. The ceremonial signing, which took place at the Texas Women's Hall of Fame, was attended by outspoken NCAA volleyball player Macy Petty and former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines, among others.
It's pretty amazing that this law is even necessary. If you have eyes and a brain and any amount of common sense, you can easily comprehend the fact that men on average, and this is a fact, are taller, stronger, more powerful, can jump higher than women. And I can attest to the extreme discomfort in the locker room when you turn around and there's a 6'4", 22-year-old male fully intact with and exposing male genitalia inches away from where you're simultaneously undressing.
While the event was peaceful inside, outside was a different story as scores of protesters lined the streets.
They were very hostile. We had to stay in the event space longer than anticipated because people who were leaving were getting spit on and harassed.
Macy Petty, who's a senior volleyball player at Lee University in Tennessee, said that it was so hostile, eventually police had to escort them out a back entrance.
It was kind of this absurd experience of seeing them calling third graders transphobes when all they want to do is play girls' sports against other girls.
The issue at hand is whether the current bill unfairly limits transgender athletes from playing sports, something Petty pushes back against.
If you identify as transgender, you're not exempt from basic rules that girls have to play on girls teams and boys have to play on boys teams. And so if we get rid of those barriers between sports, then girls' sports just simply won't exist anymore.
Petty says most of the media has tried to amplify those opposing opinions and that the majority of female athletes she comes across do not agree that a male identifying as a female automatically negates their inborn biological advantages, not to mention their presence in the locker room.
There is no girl that I know of that is totally fine walking into a restroom having no sex-based protections, keeping men from walking in.
In addition, Petty points out the case of high school volleyball player Peyton McNabb, who suffered a concussion and neck injury when a transgender athlete spiked the ball in her face last September, causing partial paralysis and impaired vision.
That injury was completely avoidable if the state legislature would have been proactive. And the truth is that this is happening at every level in every sport. I met elementary school girls who are having to go through this. And the idea that this is a non-issue is simply not true.
Now, currently 20 states have passed similar forms of legislation like Texas's, which goes into effect next month. I'm Dave Martin for NTD News.
There are thousands of students across the country afraid to voice their values and beliefs. A lawyer tells NTD's David Lamb that it's a culture issue when people are silenced. Here's the conversation with attorney Daniel Ortner.
Daniel Ortner, attorney with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Thank you for joining me again. I know we just recently spoke about a case that you're working on regarding free speech at a Clovis Community College. So can you tell me, as an attorney, what have you been seeing in the overall landscape when it comes to students' free speech?
Yeah, I think students right now are often very afraid of speaking out. The surveys that FIRE does every year, the organization I work for, national surveys of thousands of students across the country, show that large majorities, last year's survey had 63% of students worried that if they said what they believed, it would hurt their reputation. They can't talk about important topics like abortion, like LGBT rights, like any of these highly controversial topics. They just can't talk about them at all, especially if they disagree with the consensus on these topics. They are afraid that they'll get worse grades, that they'll be have a significant backlash, that they'll be silenced. And unfortunately, on the other hand, you have a lot of students feeling free to shout down speakers, to cancel those that are coming on campus to speak out.
How have we gone to this point where the culture has shifted, where there is controversy and censorship regarding people's differing opinions, especially within colleges? It's meant to have broad discussion and seminars.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of forgotten what universities are meant to be, which is a place where free speech and free ideas are expressed and debated. They're really meant to be marketplaces of ideas, laboratories for democracy, places where students, professors, and others can debate important ideas and come to their own conclusion. Whether you're left, right, center, doesn't matter where you stand on the political spectrum. Free speech is a precious right that needs to be protected for everyone, including those we disagree with. Public universities, are state actors. They are bound by the First Amendment to the Constitution, and so they cannot put other values above free speech.
Thank you so much, Daniel Ortner, attorney with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. It's great to have you back on our show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you have any news tips or feedback for our show, remember that you can email us at eveningnews@ntd.com. And that's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Stephanie Cox. Good night.